Hello. Welcome to Storytime with Moog. I am Moog, and today we are starting The Hunchback of Notre-Dame by Victor Hugo. But first, okay, reading updates. I am reading Bookshops and Bone Dust by Travis Baldree. It is the same author, same universe, same main character as Legends and Lattes, and it actually takes place before Legends and Lattes. So we have Viv, who is an arc, she's a mercenary, and she gets injured. And so her crew takes her to a small, like, seaside village and while she's recovering, she stumbles into a bookshop that is falling apart, and she falls in love with reading and with books, and she's also helping the owner like bring things back together, and it is just so cozy and so great, and I love everything about it because they're like talking about like, well, what did you think about this book, well, what did you think about this character, type of a thing, and it is so good. It's so good. And that's all I'm reading right now. I will be starting on Sunday, which I'm doing an extra reading sprint on Sunday morning, 9 a.m. Central to noon, and I'll be starting Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler because it is the Patreon buddy read, book club read for April. But yeah, I think that's all that I'm reading. Okay, but today we're doing Hunchback of Notre-Dame. I did a lot of extensive research, and by that I mean I pulled up the Wikipedia page to give us a little bit of background before we just hop into another Victor Hugo romp. Um, because obviously all of his stuff has been nothing but giggles. So, a little background before we hop in. So, the original name in was Notre-Dame de Paris, 1482, and it was published in 1831. The title refers to the Notre-Dame Cathedral, which features prominently throughout the novel. It focuses on the unfortunate story of Quasimodo, the Roma street dancer Esmeralda, and Quasimodo's guardian, the Archdeacon Claude Frollo, in the 15th century Paris. All its elements, the Renaissance setting, impossible love affairs, and marginalized characters make the work a model of the literary themes of Romanticism. The novel is considered a classic of French literature and has been adapted repeatedly for film, stage, and television. Some prominent examples include a 1923 silent film, a 1939 sound film, and a 1956 film with Anthony Quinn, and a 1996 Disney animated film. Written during a time of cultural upheaval, the novel champions historical preservation. Hugo solidified Notre-Dame de Paris as a national icon, arguing for the preservation of Gothic architecture as an element of Paris's cultural heritage. And then one other thing that I just want to throw out because I thought it was weird. Legend has it that Hugo locked himself in his room, getting rid of his clothes to write the novel on time. The idea being he couldn't go outside without clothes. However, the validity of the truth of this story has muddled down over time. But I just thought that was wild, and I needed to share that. And it looks like, due to Hugo's other literary projects, the novel fell by the wayside until 1831. So he was working on it in 1828, and then he just got distracted. I would not know anything ever about being distracted by anything ever because I've never been distracted in my life. Exactly. There's a definite motivation there. Yeah, yeah. So this book is bleak, dark. There's content warnings, so please take care of yourself if we come across anything. I don't want anything to be, too upsetting. So if you need to step out or take a break, I totally understand. Also, want to state this as well. The views in this story are not my own views, and Victor Hugo's writing a lot of the time is very pointed and sometimes graphic. So just want to state this before we hop in. All right, so let's do it. Let's get started. Let's do this. Notre-Dame de Paris, also known as The Hunchback of Notre-Dame, by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabel F. Hapgood. Apologies for any mispronunciations, and there will be a lot. Preface. A few years ago, while visiting, or rather, rummaging about Notre-Dame, the author of this book found, in an obscure nook of one of the towers, the following word engraved by hand upon the wall. These Greek capitals, black with age and quite deeply graven in the stone, with I know not what signs peculiar to Gothic calligraphy imprinted upon their forms and upon their attitudes, as though with the purpose of revealing that it had been a hand of the Middle Ages which had inscribed them there, and especially the fatal and melancholy meaning contained in them struck the author deeply. He questioned himself. He sought to divine who could have been that soul in torment which had not been willing to quit this world without leaving this stigma of crime or unhappiness upon the brow of the ancient church. Afterwards, the wall was whitewashed or scraped down, I know not which, and the inscription disappeared. For it is thus that people have been in the habit of proceeding with the marvelous churches of the Middle Ages for the last 200 years. Mutilations came to them from every quarter, from within as well from without. The priest whitewashes them, the archdeacon scrapes them down, and the populace arrives and demolishes them. Thus, with the exception of the fragile memory which the author of this book here consecrates to it, there remains today nothing whatever of the mysterious word engraved within the gloomy tower of Notre-Dame, nothing of the destiny which it so sadly summed up. The man who wrote that word upon the wall disappeared from the midst of the generations of men many centuries ago. The word, in its turn, has been effaced from the wall of the church. The church will, perhaps, itself soon disappear from the face of the earth. It is upon this word that this book is founded. March 1831. Now we're getting into it. That was cool. I like that little snippet of context. Volume 1, Book 1st, Chapter 1, The Grand Hall. 348 years, 6 months, and 19 days ago today, the Parisians awoke to the sound of all the bells in the triple circuit of the city, the university, and the town ringing a full peal. The 6th of January, 1482, is not, however, a day of which history has preserved the memory. There was nothing notable in the event which thus set the belles and the bourgeois of Paris in a ferment from early morning. It was neither an assault by the Picards, nor the Burgundians, nor a hunt led along in procession, nor a revolt of scholars in the town of Las, nor an entry of our much dread lord, Monsieur the King. nor even a pretty hanging of male and female thieves by the courts of Paris. Neither was it the arrival, so frequent in the 15th century, of some plumed and bedizened embassy. It was barely 2 days since the last cavalcade of that nature, that of the Flemish ambassadors charged with concluding the marriage between the Dauphin and Marguerite of Flanders, had made its entry into Paris, to the great annoyance of Monsieur le Cardinal de Bourbon, who, for the sake of pleasing the king, had been obliged to assume an amiable mien towards this whole rustic rabble of Flemish burgomasters, and to regale them at his Hôtel de Bourbon with a very pretty morality, allegorical satire, and farce, while a driving rain drenched the magnificent tapestries at his door. What put the whole population of Paris in commotion, as Jehan de Troyes expresses it on the 6th of January, was the double solemnity, united from time immemorial, of the Epiphany and the Feast of Fools. On that day there was to be a bonfire on the Place de Grève, a maypole at the Chapelle de Broc, and a mystery at the Palais de Justice. It had been cried to the sound of the trumpet the preceding evening at all the crossroads by the provost's men, clad in handsome, short, sleeveless coats of violet camelot, with large white crosses upon their breasts. So the crowd of citizens, male and female, having closed their houses and shops, thronged from every direction at early morn towards some one of the 3 spots designated. Each had made his choice: one, the bonfire; another, the maypole; another, the mystery play. It must be stated, in honor of the good sense of the loungers of Paris, that the greater part of this crowd directed their steps towards the bonfire, which was quite in season, or towards the mystery play, which was to be presented in the grand hall of the Palais de Justice, the courts of law, which was well roofed and walled, and that the curious left the poor, scantily flowered maypole to shiver all alone beneath the sky of January in the cemetery of the chapel of Broc. The populace thronged the avenues of the law courts in particular, because they knew that the Flemish ambassadors, who had arrived 2 days previously, intended to be present at the representation of the mystery, and at the election of the Pope of the Fools, which was also to take place in the grand hall. It was no easy matter, on that day, to force one's way into that grand hall, although it was then reputed to be the largest covered enclosure in the world. It is true that Sauval had not yet measured the grand hall of the chateau of Montargis. The palace place, encumbered with people, offered to the curious gazers at the windows the aspect of a sea, into which 5 or 6 streets, like so many mouths of rivers, discharged every moment fresh floods of heads. The waves of this crowd, augmented incessantly, dashed against the angles of the houses which projected here and there, like so many promontories, into the irregular basin of the place. In the center of the lofty Gothic facade of the palace, the grand staircase incessantly ascended and descended by a double current which, after parting on the intermediate landing place, flowed in broad waves along its lateral slopes. The grand staircase, I say, trickled incessantly into the place, like a cascade into a lake. And there's a footnote here, right after, in the center of the lofty Gothic, right after Gothic, and it says, the word Gothic in the sense in which it is generally employed, is wholly unsuitable, but wholly consecrated. Hence we accept it and we adopt it, like all the rest of the world, to characterize the architecture of the second half of the Middle Ages, where the ogive is the principle which succeeds the architecture of the first period, of which the semicircle is the father. The cries, the laughter, the trampling of those thousands of feet produced a great noise and a great clamor. From time to time, this noise and clamor redoubled. The current which drove the crowd towards the grand staircase flowed backwards, became troubled, formed whirlpools. This was produced by the buffet of an archer, or the horse of one of the provost's sergeants, which kicked to restore order, an admirable tradition which the provostship has bequeathed to the constabulary to the marechaussee, to our gendarmerie of Paris. Thousands of good, calm, bourgeois faces thronged the windows, the doors, the dormer windows, the roofs, gazing at the palace, gazing at the populace, and asking nothing more. For many Parisians content themselves with the spectacle of the spectators, and a wall behind which something is going on becomes at once, for us, a very curious thing indeed. If it could be granted to us, the men of 1830, to mingle in thought with those Parisians of the 15th century, and to enter with them, jostled, elbowed, pulled about into that immense hall of the palace, which was so cramped on that 6th of January, 1482, the spectacle would not be devoid of either interest or charm, and we should have about us only things that were so old that they would seem new. With the reader's consent, we will endeavor to retrace in thought the impression which he would have experienced in company with us on crossing the threshold of that grand hall, in the midst of that tumultuous crowd in surcoats, short, sleeveless jackets, and doublets. And, first of all, there is a buzzing in the ears, a dazzlement in the eyes. Above our heads is a double ogive vault, paneled with wood carving, painted azure, and sown with golden fleur-de-lis. Beneath our feet, a pavement of black and white marble alternating. A few paces distant, an enormous pillar, then another, then another. 7 pillars in all down the length of the hall, sustaining the spring of the arches of the double vault in the center of its width. Around 4 of the pillars, stalls of merchants, all sparkling with glass and tinsel. Around the last 3, benches of oak, worn and polished by the trunk hose of the litigants and the robes of the attorneys. Around the hall, along the lofty wall, between the doors, between the windows, between the pillars, the interminable row of all the kings of France, from Pharamond down, the lazy kings with pendant arms and downcast eyes, the valiant and combative kings with heads and arms raised boldly heavenward. Then, in the long pointed windows, glass of 1,000 hues, at the wide entrances to the hall, rich doors, finely sculptured, and all the vaults, pillars, walls, jambs, paneling, doors, statues, covered from top to bottom with a splendid blue and gold illumination, which, a trifle tarnished at the epoch when we behold it, had almost entirely disappeared beneath dust and spiders in the year of grace 1549, when de Broglie still admired it from tradition. Let the reader picture to himself now this immense, oblong hall, illuminated by the pallid light of a January day, invaded by a motley and noisy throng which drifts along the walls and eddies round the 7 pillars, and he will have a confused idea of the whole effect of the picture, whose curious details we shall make an effort to indicate with more precision. It is certain that if Rabelais had not assassinated Henry IV, there would have been no documents in the trial of Rabelais deposited in the clerk's office of the Palais de Justice. No accomplices interested in causing the said documents to disappear. Hence, no incendiaries obliged, for lack of better means, to burn the clerk's office in order to burn the documents, and to burn the Palais de Justice in order to burn the clerk's office. Consequently, in short, no conflagration in 1618. The old palace would be standing still, with its ancient grand hall. I should be able to say to the reader, go and look at it, and we should thus both escape the necessity, I of making and he of reading a description of it, such as it is. Which demonstrates a new truth, that great events have incalculable results. It is true that it may be quite possible, in the first place, that Rabelais had no accomplices, and in the second, that if he had any, they were in no way connected with the fire of 1618. 2 other very plausible explanations exist. First, the great flaming star, a foot broad and a cubit high, which fell from heaven, as everyone knows, upon the law courts, after midnight on the 7th of March, 2nd. Theophil's quatrain. Sure, 'twas but a sorry game when at Paris Dame Justice, through having eaten too much spice, set the palace all aflame. Whatever may be thought of this triple explanation, political, physical, and poetical, of the burning of the law courts in 1618, the unfortunate fact of the fire is certain. Very little today remains, thanks to this catastrophe. Thanks, above all, to the successive restorations which have completed what it spared. Very little remains of that first dwelling of the kings of France, of that elder palace of the Louvre, already so old in the time of Philip the Handsome, that they sought there for the traces of the magnificent buildings erected by King Robert and described by Helgaldus. Nearly everything has disappeared. What has become of the chamber of the Chancellery, where St. Louis consummated his marriage, the garden where he administered justice, clad in a coat of camelot, a surcoat of linsey woolsey, without sleeves, and a surmantle of black sandal, as he lay upon the carpet with Joinville? Where is the chamber of the Emperor Sigismund, and that of Charles IV., that of Jeanne the Landless? Where is the staircase from which Charles VI promulgated his edict of pardon, the slab where Marcel cut the throats of Robert de Clermont and the Marshal de Champagne in the presence of the Dauphin, the wicket where the bulls of Pope Benedict were torn, and whence those who had wrought them departed decked out in derision in copes and mitres, and making an apology through all Paris, and the grand hall with its gilding, its azure, its statues, its pointed arches, its pillars, its immense vault, all fretted with carvings, and the gilded chamber, and the stone lion, which stood at the door with lowered head and tail between his legs, like the lions on the throne of Solomon, in the humiliated attitude which befits force in the presence of justice, and the beautiful doors, and the stained glass, and the chaste ironwork, which drove Biscornet to despair, and the delicate woodwork of Hansi. What has time, what have men done with these marvels? What have they given us in return for all this Gaelic history, for all this Gothic art? The heavy flattened arches of Monsieur de Brosse, that awkward architect of the Saint Gervais portal. So much for art, and as for history, we have the gossiping reminiscence of the great pillar still ringing with the tattle of the patchfru. It is not much. Let us return to the veritable grand hall of the veritable old palace. The two extremities of this gigantic parallelogram were occupied. The one by the famous marble table, so long, so broad, and so thick that, as the ancient land rolls in a style that would have given Gargantua an appetite, say, such a slice of marble as was never beheld in the world. The other by the chapel where Louis XI had himself sculptured on his knees before the Virgin, and whither he caused to be brought, without heeding, the two gaps thus made in the row of royal statues, the statues of Charlemagne and of Saint Louis, two saints whom he supposed to be great in favor in heaven, as kings of France. This chapel, quite new, having been built only 6 years, was entirely in that charming taste of delicate architecture, of marvelous sculpture, of fine and deep chasing, which marks with us the end of the Gothic era, and which is perpetuated to about the middle of the 16th century in the fairy-like fancies of the Renaissance. The little open-work rose window pierced above the portal was, in particular, a masterpiece of lightness and grace. One would have pronounced it a star of lace. In the middle of the hall, opposite the great door, a platform of gold brocade placed against the wall, a special entrance to which has been effected through a window in the corridor of the gold chamber, and had been erected for the Flemish emissaries of the other great personages invited to the presentation of the mystery play. It was upon the marble table that the mystery was to be enacted, as usual. It had been arranged for the purpose, early in the morning, its rich slabs of marble, all scratched by the heels of law clerks, supported a cage of carpenter's work of considerable height, the upper surface of which, within view of the whole hall, was to serve as the theatre, and whose interior, masked by tapestries, was to take the place of dressing rooms for the personages of the piece. A ladder, naively placed on the outside, was to serve as means of communication between the dressing room and the stage, and lend its rude rungs to entrances as well as to exits. This was no personage, however, unexpected, no sudden change, no theatrical event which was not obliged to mount the ladder. Innocent and venerable infancy of art and contrivances. 4 of the bailiff of the palace's sergeants, perfunctory guardians of all the pleasures of the people, on days of festival as well as on days of execution, stood at the 4 corners of the marble table. The piece was only to begin with the 12th stroke of the great palace clock, sounding midday. It was very late, no doubt, for a theatrical representation, but they had been obliged to fix the hour to suit the convenience of the ambassadors. Now, this whole multitude had been waiting since morning. A goodly number of curious, good people had been shivering since daybreak before the grand staircase of the palace. Some even affirmed that they had passed the night across the threshold of the great door, in order to make sure that they should be the first to pass in. The crowd grew more dense every moment, and, like water which rises above its normal level, began to mount along the walls, to swell around the pillars, to spread out on the entablatures, on the cornices, on the window-sills, on all the salient points of the architecture, on all the reliefs of the sculpture. Hence, discomfort, impatience, weariness, the liberty of a day of cynicism and folly, the quarrels which break forth for all sorts of causes. A pointed elbow, an iron-shod shoe, the fatigue of long waiting, had already, long before the hour appointed for the arrival of the ambassadors, imparted a harsh and bitter accent to the clamor of these people who were shut in, fitted into each other, pressed, trampled upon, stifled. Nothing was to be heard but imprecations on the Flemish, the provost of the merchants, the Cardinal de Bourbon, the bailiff of the courts, Madame Marguerite of Austria, the sergeants with their rods, the cold, the heat, the bad weather, the Bishop of Paris, the Pope of the Fools, the pillars, the statues, that closed door, that open window, all to the vast amusement of a band of scholars and lackeys scattered through the mass, who mingled with all this contentment their teasing remarks and their malicious suggestions, and pricked the general bad temper with a pin, so to speak. Among the rest there was a group of those merry imps who, after smashing the glass in a window, had seated themselves heartily on the entablature, and from that point dispatched their gaze and their railleries, both within and without, upon the throng in the hall, and the throng upon the place. It was easy to see from their parodied gestures, their ringing laughter, the bantering appeals which they exchanged with their comrades from one end of the hall to the other, that these young clerks did not share the weariness and fatigue of the rest of the spectators, and that they understood very well the art of extracting for their own private diversion, from that which they had under their eyes, a spectacle which made them await the other with patience. "Upon my soul, so it's you, Johannes Frollo de Molendino," cried one of them, a sort of little light-haired imp, with a well-favoured and malign countenance, clinging to the acanthus leaves of a capital. "You are well named John of the Mill, for your 2 arms and your 2 legs have the air of 4 wings fluttering on the breeze. How long have you been here?" "By the mercy of the devil," retorted Johannes Frollo. "These 4 hours had more, and more, and I hope that they will be reckoned to my credit in purgatory. I heard the 8 singers of the King of Sicily intone the first verse of 7 o'clock Mass in the Sainte-Chapelle." "Fine singers," replied the other, with voices even more pointed than their caps. "Before founding a Mass for Monsieur Saint John, the king should have inquired whether Monsieur Saint John likes Latin droned out in a provincial accent." "He did it for the sake of employing those accursed singers of the King of Sicily," cried an old woman sharply from among the crowd beneath the window. "I just put it to you. 1,000 livres parisis for a Mass, and out of tax on sea fish in the markets of Paris to boot." "Peace, old crone," said a tall, grave person, stopping up his nose on the side toward the fishwife. "A Mass had to be founded. Would you wish the king to fall ill again?" "Bravely spoken, Sire Giles Le Cornu, Master Friar of King's Robes," cried the little student, clinging to the capital. A shout of laughter from all the students greeted the unlucky name of the poor furrier of the King's Robes. "Le Cornu, Giles Le Cornu," said some. "Cornutus et Hirsostus," horned and hairy. Another went on. He, of course, continued the small imp on the capital. What are they laughing at? An honorable man is Giles Lecornu, brother of Master Jehan Lecornu, provost of the king's house, son of Master Mahet Lecornu, first porter of the Bois de Vincennes, all bourgeois of Paris, all married from father to son. The gaiety redoubled. The big furrier, without uttering a word in reply, tried to escape all the eyes riveted upon him from all sides, but he perspired and panted in vain. Like a wedge entering the wood, his efforts served only to bury still more deeply in the shoulders of his neighbors his large, apoplectic face, purple with spite and rage. At length one of these, as fat, short, and venerable as himself, came to his rescue. Abomination, scholars addressing a bourgeois in that fashion in my day, would have been flogged, which would have afterwards been used to burn them. The whole band burst into laughter. Olahi, who is scolding so? Who is that screech owl of ill fortune? Hold, I know him, said one of them. 'Tis Master Andre Mousnier. Because he is one of the forsworn booksellers of the university, said the other. Everything goes by fours in that shop, cried a third. The 4 nations, the 4 faculties, the 4 feasts, the 4 procurators, the 4 electors, the 4 booksellers. Well, began Jean Frollo once more, we must play the devil with them. And there's a footnote right where that left off. And it says... Oh, it's in French. Okay. Fais le diable à côté. Mousnier will burn your books. Mousnier will beat your lackeys. Mousnier will kiss your wife. That fine, big Mademoiselle Audarge, who is as fresh and as happy as though she were a widow. Devil take you, growled Master Andre Mousnier. Master Andre, pursued Jean, still clinging to his capital, hold your tongue, or I'll drop on your head. Master Andre raised his eyes, seemed to measure in an instant the height of the pillar, the weight of the scamp, mentally multiplied that weight by the square of the velocity, and remained silent. Jehan, master of the field of battle, pursued triumphantly. That's what I'll do, even if I am the brother of an archdeacon. Fine gentry are our people of the university, not to have caused our privileges to be respected on such a day as this. However, there is a maypole and a bonfire in town. A mystery Pope of the Fools, the Flemish ambassadors in the city, and at the university. Nothing. Nevertheless, the place Maubert is sufficiently large, interposed one of the clerks established on the window-sill. Down with the rector, the electors, and the procurators, cried Johannes. We must have a bonfire this evening in the Champ Galliard, went on the other, made of Master Andre's books. And the desks of the scribes, added his neighbor, and the beetles' wands, and the spittoons of the deans, and the cupboards of the procurators, and the hutches of the electors, and the stool of the rector. Down with them, put in little Jehan as counterpoint. Down with Master Andre, the beetles, and the scribes, the theologians, the doctors, and the decretists, the procurators, the electors, and the rector. The end of the world has come, muttered Master Andre, stopping up his ears. By the way, there's the rector. See, he is passing through the place, cried one of those in the window. Each rivaled his neighbor in his haste to turn toward the place. "Is that really our venerable rector, Master Thibaut?" demanded Johann Frollo de Moulin, who, as he was clinging to one of the inner pillars, could not see what was going on outside. Yes, yes, replied all the others. It is really he, Master Thibaut, the rector. It was, in fact, the rector of all the dignitaries of the university, who were marching in procession in front of the embassy, and at that moment traversing the place. The students crowded into the window, saluted them as they passed with sarcasms and ironical applause. The rector, who was walking at the head of his company, had to support the first broadside. It was severe. "Good day, monsieur le rector. Hola he. Good day there." "How does he manage to be here, the old gambler? Has he abandoned his dice?" "How he trots along on his mule, her ears not so long as his." "Hola he. Good day, monsieur le rector Thibaut." "Old fool, old gambler. God preserve you, did you throw double six often last night? Oh, what a decrepit face, livid and haggard and drawn with the love of gambling and of dice. Where are you, bound for in that fashion, Thibaut, with your back turned to the university and trotting towards the town?" "He is on his way, no doubt, to seek a lodging in the Rue Thibautot," cried Johann de Monsieur Moulin. The entire band repeated this quip in a voice of thunder, clapping their hands furiously. "You are going to seek a lodging in the Rue Thibautot, are you not, Monsieur le Rector, gamester on the side of the devil?" Then came the turns of the other dignitaries. "Down with the beadles, down with the mace-bearers. Tell me, Robin Poisson, who is that yonder?" "He is Gilbert de Sully, Gilbertus de Soliaco, the chancellor of the College of Autun." "Hold on, here's my shoe. You are better placed than I. Fling it in his face. Down with the 6 theologians, with their white surplices." "Are those the theologians? I thought they were the white geese given by Saint Genevieve to the city for the fief of Rugni. Down with the doctors, down with the Cardinal Dispatians and quibblers. My cap to you, Chancellor of Saint Genevieve. You have done me a wrong. 'Tis true, he gave my place in the nation of Normandy to little Ascanio Falzapata, who comes from the province of Bourges, since he is an Italian." "That is an injustice," said all the scholars. "Down with the Chancellor of Saint Genevieve." "Ho he, Master Joachim de Landau, ho he, Louis de Huy, ho he, Lambert Hochtemem. May the devil stifle the procurator of the German nation, and the chaplains of the Saint Chapelle with their grey amices. Masters of the art, all the beautiful black cops, all the fine red cops. They make a fine tale for the rector. One would say that he was a doge of Venice on his way to his bridal with the sea. Say, Gihon, here are the canons of Saint Genevieve. To the deuce of the whole set of canons. Abbe Claude Chouart, Dr. Claude Chouart, are you in search of Marie la Giffarde? She is in the Rue de Glutton. She is making the bed of the king of the debauchees. She is paying her 4 deniers. Would you like to have her pay you in the face? Comrades, Master Simon Sanguine, the Elector of Picardy, with his wife on the crupper. Post equitem sedit atra cura. Behind the horseman sits Black Care. Courage, Master Simon. Good day, Mr. Elector. Good day, Madam Electress. How happy they are to see all that, sighed Johann de Molendino, still perched in the foliage of his capital. Meanwhile, the sworn bookseller of the university, Master Andre Mousnier, was inclining his ear to the furrier of the king's robes, Master Giles Lecornu. I tell you, sir, that the end of the world has come. No one has ever beheld such outbreaks among the students. It is the accursed inventions of this century that are ruining everything. Artilleries, bombards, and, above all, printing, that other German pest. No more manuscripts. No more books. Printing will kill bookselling. It is the end of the world that is drawing nigh. I see that plainly from the progress of velvet stuffs, said the fur merchant. At this moment, midday sounded. Ha! Exclaimed the entire crowd in one voice. The scholars held their peace. Then a great hurly-burly ensued, a vast movement of feet, hands, and heads. A general outbreak of coughs and handkerchiefs. Each one arranged himself, assumed his post, raised himself up, and grouped himself. Then came a great silence. All necks remained outstretched, all mouths remained open, all glances were directed towards the marble table. Nothing made its appearance there. The bailiff's 4 sergeants were still there, stiff, motionless, as painted statues. All eyes turned to the estrade, reserved for the Flemish envoys. The door remained closed, the platform empty. This crowd had been waiting since daybreak for 3 things: noonday, the embassy from Flanders, the mystery play. Noonday alone had arrived on time. On this occasion, it was too much. They waited 1, 2, 3, 5 minutes, a quarter of an hour. Nothing came. The dais remained empty, the theater dumb. In the meantime, wrath had succeeded its impatience. Irritated words circulated in the low tone. Still, it is true. The mystery, they murmured in hollow voices. Heads began to ferment. A tempest, which was only rumbling in the distance as yet, was floating on the surface of this crowd. It was Johann de Moulin who struck the first spark from it. The mystery, and to the devil with the Flemings, he exclaimed at the full force of his lungs, twining like a serpent around his pillar. The crowd clapped their hands. The mystery, it repeated, and made the devils take Flanders. We must have the mystery instantly, resumed the student, or else my advice is that we should hang the bailiff for the courts, or by way of a morality of a comedy. Well said, cried the people, and let us begin the hanging with his sergeants. The grand acclamation followed. The 4 poor fellows began to turn pale and to exchange glances. The crowd hurled itself towards them, and they already beheld the frail wooden railing which separated from it, giving way and bending before the pressure of the throng. It was a critical moment. To the sack! To the sack! rose the cry on all sides. At that moment, the tapestry of the dressing-room, which we have described above, was raised, and afforded passage to a personage, the mere sight of whom suddenly stopped the crowd, and changed its wrath into curiosity as by enchantment. Silence! Silence! The personage, but little reassured, and trembling in every limb, advanced to the edge of the marble table with a vast amount of bows, which, in proportion as he drew nearer, more and more resembled genuflections. In the meanwhile, tranquillity had gradually been restored. All that remained was that slight murmur which always rises above the silence of a crowd. We shall have the honor of declaiming and representing before His Eminence, Monsieur the Cardinal, a very beautiful morality which has for its title the good judgment of Madame the Virgin Mary. I am to play Jupiter. His Eminence is, at this moment, escorting the very honorable embassy of the Duke of Austria, which is detained at present, listening to the harangue of Monsieur the Rector of the University, at the Gate Baudet. As soon as His illustrious Eminence, the Cardinal, arrives, we will begin. It is certain that nothing less than the intervention of Jupiter was required to save the 4 unfortunate sergeants of the bailiff of the courts. If we had the happiness of having invented this very veracious tale, and of being, in consequence, responsible for it being our lady criticism, it is not against us that the classic precept, nec Deus intersit, could be invoked. Moreover, the costume of Signor Jupiter was very handsome, and contributed not a little towards calming the crowd, by attracting all its attention. Jupiter was clad in a coat of mail, covered with black velvet, with gilt nails, and had it not been for the rouge, and the huge red beard, each of which covered 1/2 of his face, had it not been for the roll of gilded cardboard, spangled and all bristling with strips of tinsel, which he held in his hand, and in which the eyes of the initiated easily recognized thunderbolts, and had not his feet been flesh-colored and banded with ribbons in Greek fashion, he might have borne comparison, so far as the severity of his mien was concerned, with a Breton archer from the guard of Monsieur de Berry. End of chapter 1. All of that was chapter 1. Okay, so very high notes of what this chapter was. We get a description of the cathedral, and we have a bustling city. In this very dense chapter, we have a bustling city. Everybody is on the streets waiting for a couple things. There's a maypole, there's to be a mystery, there's to be something else. And like amongst this, we're also getting murmurs of, like, well, this merchant shouldn't be here, and these what am I trying to say? These dignitaries shouldn't be here, and we should just be burning all the books. And so, like, this little unrest is just simmering. We're getting it very early on, which I'm sure is going to carry through. And I feel like we have such a good picture already of where the rest of this story is going to go. We have brilliant architecture and brilliant description by Victor Hugo telling us what this architecture is, and is like, dear reader, because you were not here during this, let me tell you what these uses of this cathedral was for, and all of these things, and how it has been used and ruined and changed throughout the years. And then we also get the people, which is a good picture. We get Frollo very early on. And we get his character established pretty early on, that he is very standoffish and has a lot of prejudices, which will absolutely be made very clear later on. So, yeah. very, very good introduction. Very, and we did this with the Man Who Laughs. Just the way that Hugo writes is very pointed, but also very beautifully descriptive. It's so good. And it's like, well, of course you have been exiled from your country. Of course your country does not like to read about itself in this way. Of course. So, enjoying, and the stage has been set. The stage has been set, and I'm so excited to see where we go from here. Okay. Chapter 2. Pierre Gringoire. Nevertheless, as he harangued them, the satisfaction and admiration unanimously excited by his costume were dissipated by his words, and when he reached that untoward conclusion, "As soon as his illustrious eminence, the cardinal, arrives, we will begin," his voice was drowned in a thunder of hooting. "Begin instantly! The mystery immediately!" shrieked the people. And above all the voices, that of Johann de Molendino was audible, piercing the uproar like the fife's derisive serenade. "Commence instantly!" yelped the scholar. "Down with Jupiter and the Cardinal de Bourbon!" vociferated Robin, Proserpine, and the other clerks perched in the window. "The morality, this very instant," repeated the crowd. "This very instant, the sack and the rope for the comedians, and the cardinal." Poor Jupiter, haggard, frightened, pale beneath his rouge, dropped his thunderbolt, took his cap in his hand, then he bowed and trembled and stammered, "His Eminence, the ambassadors, Madame Marguerite of Flanders." He did not know what to say. In truth, he was afraid of being hung by the populace for waiting, hung by the cardinal for not having waited. He saw between the two dilemmas only an abyss, that is to say, a gallows. Luckily, someone came to rescue him from his embarrassment and assume the responsibility. An individual who was standing beyond the railing, in the free space beyond the marble table, and whom no one had yet caught sight of, since his long, thin body was completely sheltered from every visual ray by the diameter of the pillar against which he was leaning. This individual, we say, tall, gaunt, pallid, blonde, still young, although already wrinkled about the brow and cheeks, with brilliant eyes and a smiling mouth, clad in garments of black serge, worn and shining with age, approached the marble table and made a sign to the poor sufferer. But the other was so confused that he did not see them. The newcomer advanced another step. "Jupiter," he said, "my dear Jupiter." The other did not hear. At last, the tall blonde, driven out of patience, shrieked almost in his face, "Michel Gibbon!" "Who calls me?" said Jupiter, as though awakened with a start. "I," replied the person clad in black. "Ah," said Jupiter. "Begin at once," went on the other. "Satisfy the populace. I undertake to appease the bailiff, who will appease Monsieur the Cardinal." Jupiter breathed once more. "We are going to begin at once." "Evoe Jupiter! All hail Jupiter! Applaud, citizens!" shouted the scholars. "Noel! Noel! Good! Good!" shouted the people. The hand-clapping was deafening, and Jupiter had already withdrawn under his tapestry, while the hall still trembled with acclamations. In the meanwhile, the personage who had so magically turned the tempest into dead calm, as our old and dear Corneille puts it, had modestly retreated to the half-shadow of his pillar, and would, no doubt, have remained invisible there, motionless and mute as before, had he not been plucked by the sleeve by two young women who, standing in the front row of the spectators, had noticed his colloquy with Michel Jupiter. "Master," said one of them, making him a sign to approach. "Hold your tongue, my dear," said her neighbor, pretty, fresh, and very brave in consequence of being dressed up in her best attire. "He is not a clerk. He is a layman. You must not say master to him, but monsieur." "Monsieur," said Leonard. The stranger approached the railing. "What would you have of me, damsels?" he asked with alacrity. "Oh, nothing," replied Leonard, in great confusion. "It is my neighbor, Gisquette, la Ghislaine, who wishes to speak with you." "Not so," replied Gisquette, blushing. "It is Leonard who called you, master. I only told her to say monsieur." The two young girls dropped their eyes. The man, who asked nothing better than to enter into conversation, looked at them with a smile. "So, you have nothing to say to me, damsels?" "Oh, nothing at all," replied Gisquette. "Nothing." The tall, light-haired young man retreated a step, but the two curious maidens had no mind to let slip their prize. "Monsieur," said Gisquette, with the impetuosity of an open sluice, or of a woman who has made up her mind, "do you know that soldier who is to play the part of Madame the Virgin in the Mystery?" "You mean the part of Jupiter," replied the stranger. "Yes. Isn't she so stupid? So you know Jupiter?" "Michel," replied the unknown. "Yes, madam." "He's a fine beard." "Will what they are about to say here be fine?" inquired Gisquette, timidly. "Very fine, mademoiselle," replied the unknown, without the slightest hesitation. "What is it to be?" "The good judgment of Madame the Virgin. A morality, if you please, damsel." "Ah, that makes a difference." A brief silence ensued, broken by the stranger. "It is a perfectly new morality, and one which has never yet been played." "Then it is not the same one," said Gisquette, "that was given 2 years ago, on the day of the entrance of Monsieur the Legate, and where 3 handsome maids played the part of sirens." "And all naked," added the young man. Gisquette glanced at her, and lowered her eyes. He continued, with a smile. "It is a very pleasant thing to see. Today it is a morality made expressly for Madame the Demoiselle of Flanders." "Will they sing shepherd songs?" inquired Gisquette. "Fie," said the stranger. "In a morality you must not confound styles. If it were a farce, well and good." "That is a pity," resumed Gisquette. "That day, at the fountain, there were wild men and women who fought and assumed many aspects as they sang little motets." "That is that which is suitable for a legate," returned the stranger, with a good deal of dryness, "is not suitable for a princess." "And beside him," resumed Gisquette, "played many brass instruments, making great melodies. And for the refreshments of the passers-by, the fountain spouted through three mouths wine, milk, and hippocras, of which every one drank who wished. And a little below Ponceau at the Trinity, there was a passion performed, and without any speaking." "Oh, how well I remember that!" exclaimed Cosette. "God on the cross, and the 2 thieves on the right and the left." Here the young gossips, growing warm at the memory of the entrance of Monsieur the Legate, both began to talk at once. And further on, at the Painter's Gate, there were other personages very richly clad, and at the fountain of Saint Innocent, that huntsman who was chasing a hind with great clamor of dogs and hunting horns, and at the Paris slaughterhouses, stages representing the fortress. And when the legate passed, you remember, Gisquette, they made the assault, and the English all had their throats cut, and against the gate of the Châtelet there were very fine personages, and on all the porte aux chains, which was all draped above. And when the legate passed, they let fly on the bridge more than 200 sorts of birds. Wasn't it beautiful? It will be better today, finally resumed their interlocutor, who seemed to listen to them with impatience. Do you promise us that this mystery will be fine? said Gisquette. Without a doubt, he replied. Then he added with a certain emphasis, I am the author of it, damsels. Truly, said the young girls, quite taken aback. Truly, replied the poet, bridling a little. That is to say, there are two of us. Jehan Marchand, who has sawed the planks and erected the framework of the theatre and the woodwork, and I, who have made the piece. My name is Pierre Gringoire. The author of the Cid could not have said Pierre Corneille with more pride. Our readers have been able to observe that a certain amount of time must have already elapsed from the moment when Jupiter had retired beneath the tapestry to the instant when the author of the New Morality had thus abruptly revealed himself to the innocent admiration of Gisquette and Leonard. Remarkable fact, that whole crowd, so tumultuous but a few moments before, now waited amiably on the word of the comedian, which proves the eternal truth, still experienced every day in our theatres, that the best means of making the public wait patiently is to assure them that one is about to begin instantly. However, Scholar Johann had not fallen asleep. Hola hey! He shouted suddenly, in the midst of the peaceable waiting which had followed the tumult. Jupiter, Madame the Virgin, buffoons of the devil, are you jeering at us? The piece! Commence, or we will commence again. This was all that was needed. The music of high and low instruments immediately became audible from the interior of the stage. The tapestry was raised. 4 personages, in motley attire and painted faces, emerged from it, climbed the steep ladder of the theatre, and, arrived upon the upper platform, arranged themselves in a line before the public, whom they saluted with profound reverences. Then the symphony ceased. The mystery was about to begin. The 4 personages, after having reaped a rich reward of applause for their reverences, began, in the midst of profound silence, a prologue, which we gladly spare the reader. Moreover, as happens in our own day, the public was more occupied with the costumes that the actors wore than with the roles that they were enacting, and in truth, they were right. All 4 were dressed in party-colored robes of yellow and white, which were distinguished from each other only by the nature of the stuff. The first was of gold and silver brocade, the second of silk, the third of wool, the fourth of linen. The first of these personages carried in his right hand a sword, the second 2 golden keys, the third a pair of scales, the fourth a spade, and, in order to aid sluggish minds which would have seen which would not have seen clearly through the transparency of these attributes, there was to be read in large black letters on the hem of the robe of brocade, "My name is Nobility." On the hem of the silken robe, "My name is Clergy." On the hem of the woolen robe, "My name is Merchandise." On the hem of the linen robe, "My name is Labor." The sex of the two male characters was briefly indicated to every judicious spectator by their shorter robes, and by the cap which they wore on their heads, while the two female characters, less briefly clad, were covered with hoods. Much ill will would have been required not to comprehend, through the medium of the poetry of the prologue, that labor was wedded to merchandise, and clergy to nobility, and that the two happy couples possessed in common a magnificent golden dolphin, which they desired to adjudge to the fairest only. So they were roaming about the world seeking and searching for this beauty, and, after having successfully rejected the Queen of Goncolda, the Princess of Trebizonde, the daughter of the Grand Khan of Tartary, etc., the labor and clergy, nobility and merchandise had come to rest upon the marble table of the Palais de Justice, and to utter, in the presence of the honest audience, as many sentences and maxims as could then be dispensed at the Faculty of Arts, at examinations, sophisms, determinances, figures, and acts, where the masters took their degrees. All this was, in fact, very fine. Nevertheless, in that throng upon which the four allegories vied with each other in pouring out floods of metaphors, there was no ear more attentive, no heart that palpitated more, not an eye was more haggard, no neck more outstretched than the eye, the ear, the neck, and the heart of the author, of the poet, of that brave Pierre Gringoire, who had not been able to resist, a moment before, the joy of telling his name to two pretty girls. He had retreated a few paces from them, behind his pillar, and there he listened, looked, enjoyed. The amiable applause which had greeted the beginning of his prologue was still echoing in his bosom, and he was completely absorbed in that species of ecstatic contemplation with which an author beholds his ideas fall, one by one, from the mouth of the actor into the vast silence of the audience, worthy Pierre Gringoire. It pains us to say it, but this first ecstasy was speedily disturbed. Hardly had Gringoire raised his intoxicating cup of joy and triumph to his lips, when a drop of bitterness was mingled with it. A tattered mendicant, who could not collect any coin, lost as he was in the midst of the crowd, and who had not probably found sufficient indemnity in the pockets of his neighbor, had hit upon the idea of perching himself upon some conspicuous point, in order to attract looks and alms. He had, accordingly, hoisted himself during the first verses of the prologue, with the aid of the pillars of the reserve gallery, to the cornice which ran round the balustrade at its lower edge, and there he had seated himself, soliciting the attention and the pity of the multitude, with his rags and a hideous sore which covered his right arm. However, he uttered not a word. The silence which he preserved allowed the prologue to proceed without hindrance, and no perceptible disorder would have ensued, if ill luck had not willed that the scholar Johann should catch sight from the heights of his pillar, of the mendicant and his grimaces. A wild fit of laughter took possession of the young scamp, who, without caring that he was interrupting the spectacle and disturbing the universal composure, shouted boldly, "Look! See that sickly creature asking alms!" Anyone who has thrown a stone into a frog pond or fired a shot into a covey of birds can form an idea of the effect produced by these incongruous words in the midst of the general attention. It made Gringoire shudder as though it had been an electric shock. The prologue stopped short, and all heads turned tumultuously toward the beggar, who, far from being disconcerted by this, saw, in this incident, a good opportunity for reaping his harvest, and who began to whine in a doleful way, half closing his eyes the while. "Charity, please." "Well, upon my soul," resumed Johann, "it's cloppin'. Hola, hey, my friend. Did your sore bother you on the leg that you have transferred it to your arm?" So saying, with the dexterity of a monkey, he flung a bit of silver into the grey felt hat which the beggar held in his ailing arm. The mendicant received both the alms and the sarcasm without wincing, and continued, in lamentable tones, "Charity, please." This episode considerably distracted the attention of the audience, and a goodly number of spectators, among them Robin, Ossipon, and all the clerks at their head, gaily applauded this eccentric duet, which the scholar, with his shrill voice, and the mendicant had just improvised in the middle of the prologue. Gringoire was highly displeased. On recovering from his first stupefaction, he bestirred himself to shout to the four personages on the stage, "Go on! What the devil! Go on!" without even deigning to cast a glance of disdain upon the two interrupters. At that moment he felt someone pluck at the hem of his surtout. He turned round, and not without ill humour, and found considerable difficulty in smiling. But he was obliged to do so, nevertheless. It was the pretty arms of Gisquette, which passed through the railing, was soliciting his attention in this manner. "Monsieur," said the young girl, "are they going to continue?" "Of course," replied Gringoire, a good deal shocked by the question. "In that case, monsieur," she resumed, "would you have the courtesy to explain to me—" "What are they going on? What are they about to say?" interrupted Gringoire. Well, listen." "No," said Gisquette, "but what they have said so far." Gringoire started, like a man whose wound had been probed to the quick. "A plague on the stupid and dull-witted little girl," he muttered between his teeth. From that moment forth, Gisquette was nothing to him. In the meantime, the actors had obeyed his injunction, and the public, seeing that they were beginning to ask again, began once more to listen, not without having lost many beauties in the sort of soldered joint which was formed between the two portions of the piece thus abruptly cut short. Gringoire commented on it bitterly to himself. Nevertheless, tranquillity was gradually restored. The scholar held his peace, the mendicant counted over some coins in his hat, and the piece resumed the upper hand. It was, in fact, a very fine work, and one which, as it seems to us, might be put to use today by the aid of a little rearrangement. The exposition, rather long and rather empty, that is to say, according to the rules, was simple, and Gringoire, in the candid sanctuary of his own conscience, admired its clearness. As the reader may surmise, the four allegorical personages were somewhat weary with having traversed the three sections of the world, without having found suitable opportunity for getting rid of their golden dolphin. Thereupon a eulogy of the marvelous fish, with 1,000 delicate allusions to the young betrothed of Marguerite of Flanders, then sadly cloistered in at Amboise, and without a suspicion that labor and clergy, nobility and merchandise, had just made the circuit of the world in his behalf. The said Dauphin was then young, was handsome, was stout, and, above all, magnificent origin of all royal virtues. He was the son of the Lion of France. I declare that this bold metaphor is admirable, and that the natural history of the theatre, on a day of allegory and royal marriage songs, is not in the least startled by a dolphin, who is the son of a lion. It is precisely these rare and Pindaric mixtures which prove the poet's enthusiasm. Nevertheless, in order to play the part of critic also, the poet might have developed this beautiful idea in something less than 200 lines. It is true that the mystery was to last from noon until 4 o'clock, in accordance with the orders of Monsieur the Provost, and that it was necessary to say something. Besides, the people listened patiently. All at once, in the very middle of a quarrel between Mademoiselle Merchandise and Madame Nobility, at the moment that Monsieur Labor was giving utterance to this wonderful line, "In forest ne'er was seen a more triumphant beast," the door of the reserved gallery, which had hitherto remained so inopportunely closed, opened still more inopportunely, and the ringing voice of the usher announced abruptly, His Eminence, Monseigneur the Cardinal de Bourbon. End of chapter 2. All right, chapter 2. We have the little play, The Mystery, starting. And, well, before it starts, the crowd is like, dude, you need to start, please. And the director, the creator, the poet is a little nervous to start, because if he doesn't start, he fears that he is going to be attacked and harmed and possibly killed by the crowd. But if he doesn't wait for the cardinal, then he fears that the cardinal is going to attack, hurt, possibly kill him for not waiting. So he's in this quandary. And as he's in this quandary, there's this shadowy stranger who's like, all right, go on. Go ahead and start. It'll be fine. And he addresses the audience and says, we're going to start instantly. And the audience is like immediately quiet and calms down and simmers down. And before the play, the mystery actually starts, we have two younger women in the back talking to the poet, who it turns out, the creator, Pierre. And they're going back and forth, and they're talking about like last year's performance, all of these things. And he's like, no, this is very different, I assure you, because I made it. And it is an allegory, of course. And we have 4 different actors with 4 different clothing and like 4 different like merchandise, nobility, like written on them. Very, very subtle. And in the midst of all of this, there is a beggar who is in the crowd, like asking for charity, asking for help. And this beggar gets called out by Johann, and is like, it draws the attention of everybody, which makes our poet Pierre a little upset about this, because how dare the audience's attention be drawn away from what is happening? What is happening is so, so, so important. And one of the women that he was talking with is like, can you tell me like what has happened so far? And so like that person is now dead to him, because she is, dumb-witted and doesn't understand, blah, blah, blah. And then we get the announcement of the cardinal, and that's where we left off. Chapter 3. Monsieur the Cardinal. Poor Gringoire. The din of all the great double petards, and the Saint John, the discharge of 20 arabesques on supports, the detonations of that famous serpentine of the Tower of Billy, which, during the siege of Paris on Sunday, the 26th of September, 1465, killed 7 Burgundians at one blow. The explosion of all the powder stored at the gates of the temple would have rent his ears less rudely at that solemn and dramatic moment than these few words, which fell from the lips of the usher. His Eminence, Monseigneur the Cardinal de Bourbon. It is not that Pierre Gringoire either feared or disdained Monsieur the Cardinal. He had neither the weakness nor the audacity for that. A true eclectic, as it would be expressed nowadays. Gringoire was one of those firm and lofty, moderate and calm spirits, which always now know how to bear themselves amid all circumstances, and who are full of reason and of liberal philosophy, while still setting store by cardinals. A rare, precious, and never-interrupted race of philosophers, to whom wisdom, like another Ariadne, seems to have given a clue of thread which they have been walking along unwinding since the beginning of the world through the labyrinth of human affairs. One finds them in all ages, ever the same, that is to say, always according to all times, and, without reckoning our Pierre Gringoire, who may represent them in the 15th century if we succeed in bestowing upon him the distinction which he deserves. It certainly was their spirit which animated Father Dubreuil, which he wrote in the 16th, these naively sublime words, worthy of all centuries. I am a Parisian by nation, and a Parisian in language, for Parisia in Greek signifies liberty of speech, of which I have made use even towards the cardinals, uncle and brother to Monsieur the Prince de Conti, always with respect to their greatness, and without offending any one of their suite, which is much to say. There was then neither hatred for the cardinal nor disdain for his presence, in the disagreeable impression produced upon Pierre Gringoire. Quite the contrary. Our poet had too much good sense and too threadbare a coat not to attach particular importance to having the numerous allusions in his prologue, and, in particular, the glorification of the Dauphin, son of the Lion of France, fall upon the most eminent ear. But it is not interest which predominates in the noble nature of poets. I suppose that the entity of the poet may be represented by the number 10. It is certain that a chemist, on analyzing and pharmacopolizing it, as Rabelais says, would find it composed on 1 part interest to 9 parts of self-esteem. Now, at the moment when the door had opened to admit the cardinal, the 9 parts of self-esteem in Gringoire, swollen and expanded by the breath of popular admiration, were in a state of prodigious augmentation, beneath which disappeared, as though stifled, that imperceptible molecule of which we have just remarked upon in the constitution of poets. A precious ingredient, by the way, a ballast of reality and humanity, without which they would not touch the earth. Gringoire enjoyed seeing, feeling, fingering, so to speak, an entire assembly of knaves, it is true, but what matters? stupefied, petrified, and as though asphyxiated in the presence of the incommensurable tirades which welled up every instant from all parts of his bridal song. I affirm that he shared the general beatitude, and that, quite the reverse of La Fontaine, who, at the presentation of his comedy of The Florentine, asked, "Who is the ill-bred lout who made that rhapsody?" Gringoire would gladly have inquired of his neighbor, "Whose masterpiece is this?" The reader can now judge of the effect produced upon him by the abrupt and unseasonable arrival of the cardinal. That which he had to fear was only too fully realized. The entrance of his eminence upset the audience. All heads turned towards the gallery. It was no longer possible to hear one's self. The cardinal, repeated all mouths. The unhappy prologue stopped short for the second time. The cardinal halted for a moment on the threshold of the estrade. While he was sending a rather indifferent glance around the audience, the tumult redoubled. Each person wished to get a better view of him. Each man vied with the other in thrusting his head over his neighbor's shoulder. He was, in fact, an exalted personage, the sight of whom was well worth any other comedy. Charles, Cardinal de Bourbon, Archbishop and Comte of Lyon, Primate of the Gauls, was allied both to Louis XI through his brother Pierre, Seigneur de Beaujeu, who had married the king's eldest daughter, and Charles the Bold through his mother, Agnes of Burgundy. Now, the dominating trait, the peculiar and distinct trait of the character of the primate of the Gauls, was the spirit of the courtier, and devotion to the powers that be. The reader can form an idea of the numberless embarrassments which this double relationship has caused him, and of all the temporal reefs among which his spiritual bark had been forced to tack, in order not to suffer shipwreck on either Louis or Charles, that Scylla and Charybdis, which has devoured the Duc de Nemours and the Constable of St. Paul. Thanks to heaven's mercy, he had made the voyage successfully, and had reached home without hindrance. But although he was in port, and precisely because he was in port, he never recalled, without disquiet, the varied haps of his political career, so long uneasy and laborious. Thus, he was in the habit of saying that the year 1476 had been white and black for him, meaning thereby that in the course of that year he had lost his mother, the Duchess de la Bourbonnaise, and his cousin, the Duke of Burgundy, and that one grief had consoled him for the other. Nevertheless, he was a fine man. He led a joyous cardinal's life, liked to enliven himself with the royal vintage of Chalot, did not hate Richard de Garmont and Thomas Las Saillard, bestowed alms on pretty girls rather than on old women, and for all these reasons was very agreeable to the populace of Paris. He never went about otherwise than surrounded by a small court of bishops and abbeys of high lineage, gallant, jovial, and given to carousing on occasion. And more than once the good and devout women of Saint-Germain, when passing at night beneath the brightly illuminated windows of Bourbon, had been scandalized to hear the same voices which had intoned vespers for them during the day caroling, to the clinking of glasses, the Bacchic proverb of Benedict XII, that pope who had added a third crown to the tiara, Bibamus Papiliter. It was this justly acquired popularity, no doubt, which preserved him on his entrance from any bad reception at the hands of the mob, which had been so displeased but a moment before. and very little disposed to respect a cardinal on the very day when it was to elect a pope. But the Parisians cherished little rancor, and then, having forced the beginning of the play by their authority, the good bourgeois had got the upper hand of the cardinal, and this triumph was sufficient for them. Moreover, the Cardinal de Bourbon was a handsome man. He wore a fine scarlet robe, which he carried off very well. That is to say, he had all the women on his side, and, consequently, the best half of the audience. Assuredly, it would be injustice and bad taste to hoot a cardinal for having come late to the spectacle, when he is a handsome man, and when he wears his scarlet robe well. He entered, then, bowed to those present with the hereditary smile of the great for the people, and directed his course slowly towards his scarlet velvet armchair, with the air of thinking of something quite different. His cortege, what he should nowadays call his staff, of bishops and abbeys, invaded the estrade in his train, not without causing redoubled tumult and curiosity among the audience. Each man vied with his neighbor in pointing them out and naming them, in seeing who should recognize at least one of them. This one, the Bishop of Marseille, Audoulet, if my memory serves right. This one, the Primicière of Saint-Denis. This one, Robert de l'Espinay, Abbey of Saint-Germain-le-Pré, that libertine brother of the mistress of Louis XI. All with many errors and absurdities. As for the scholars, they swore. This was their day, their feast of fools, their Saturnalia, the annual orgy of the corporation of law clerks and of the school. There was no turpitude which was not sacred on that day, and there were very gay gossips in the crowd. Simone Quatre-Livres, Agnes Lagadine, and Rabine Piedbol. Was it not the least that one could do to swear at one's ease and revile the name of God a little, on so fine a day, in such good company as dignitaries of the church and loose women? So they did not abstain, and in the midst of the uproar there was a frightful concert of blasphemies and enormities, of all the unbridled tongues, the tongues of clerks and students restrained during the rest of the year by the fear of the hot iron of Saint Louis. Poor Saint Louis, how they set him at defiance in his own court of law. Each one of them selected from the newcomers on the platform a black, gray, white, or violet cassock as his target. Johann Frollo de Molendin, in his quality of brother to an archdeacon, boldly attacked the scarlet. He sang in deafening tones with his impudent eyes fastened on the cardinal, Capa repleta nero. All these details, which we here lay bare for the edification of the reader, were so covered by the general uproar that they were lost in it before reaching the reserved platforms. Moreover, they would have moved the cardinal but little, so much a part of the customs were the liberties of that day. Moreover, he had another cause for solicitude, and his mien as wholly preoccupied with it, which entered the estrade the same time as himself. This was the embassy from Flanders. Not that he was a profound politician, nor was he borrowing trouble about the possible consequences of the marriage of his cousin Marguerite de Bourgogne to his cousin's Charles Dauphine de Vienne, nor as to how long the good understanding which had been patched up between the Duke of Austria and the King of France would last, nor how the King of England would take his disdain of his daughter. All that troubled him but little, and he gave a warm reception every evening to the wine of the royal vintage of Chaillot, without a suspicion that several flasks of that same wine, somewhat revised and corrected, It is True by Dr. Courtier, cordially offered to Edward IX by Louis XI, would, some fine morning, rid Louis XI of Edward IV. The much honoured embassy of Monsieur the Duke of Austria brought the cardinal none of these cares, but it troubled him in another direction. It was, in fact, somewhat hard, and we have already hinted at it on the second page of this book, for him, Charles de Bourbon, to be obliged to feast and receive cordially no one knows what bourgeois; for him, a cardinal, to receive aldermen; for him, a Frenchman, and a jolly companion, to receive Flemish beer-drinkers, and that in public. This was, certainly, one of the most irksome grimaces that he had ever executed for the good pleasure of the king. So he turned toward the door, and with the best grace in the world, so well had he trained himself to it, when the usher announced in a sonorous voice, "Messieurs, the envoys of Monsieur the Duke of Austria." It is useless to add that the whole hall did the same. Then arrived, two by two, with a gravity which made a contrast in the midst of the frisky ecclesiastical escort of Charles de Bourbon, the 48 ambassadors of Maximilian of Austria, having at their head the reverend father in God, Johann Abbot of Saint-Bertin, Chancellor of the Golden Fleece, and Jacques de Goy, Sieur d'Albi, Grand Bailiff of Ghent. A deep silence settled over the embassy, settled over the assembly, accompanied by stifled laughter at the preposterous names and all the bourgeois designations which each of these personages transmitted with imperturbable gravity to the usher, who then tossed names and titles pell-mell and mutilated to the crowd below. There were Master Loys Roloff, alderman of the city of Louvain; Messire Clay d'Etullet, alderman of Brussels; Messire Paul de Bost, Seigneur de Vermizelle, president of Flanders; Master Johann Colligans, burgomaster of the city of Antwerp; Master George de la Moor, first alderman of the cure of the city of Ghent; Master Geldof van der Haag, first alderman of the Parchons of the said town; and the Sieur de Bierbecu, and Johann Pinnock, and Johann de Merzey, etc., etc., bailiffs, aldermans, burgomasters, aldermans, bailiffs, all stiff, effectively grave, formal, dressed out in velvet and damask, hooded with caps of black velvet, with great tufts of cypress gold thread, good Flemish heads, after all, severe and worthy faces, of the family which Rembrandt makes to stand out so strong and grave from the black background of his night troll. Personages, all of whom bore, written on their brows, that Maximilian of Austria had done well in trusting implicitly, as the manifest ran, in their sense, valor, experience, loyalty, and good wisdom. There was one exception, however. It was a subtle, intelligent, crafty-looking face, a sort of combined monkey and diplomat phiz, before whom the cardinal made 3 steps and a profound bow, and whose name, nevertheless, was only Guillerme Rime, councillor and pensioner of the city of Ghent. Few persons were then aware who Guillaume Rime was, a rare genius who, in a time of revolution, would have made a brilliant appearance on the surface of events, but who in the 15th century was reduced to cavernous intrigues and to living in mines, as the Duc de Saint-Simon expresses it. Nevertheless, he was appreciated by the minor of Europe. He plotted familiarly with Louis XI, and often lent a hand to the king's secret jobs, all which things were quite unknown to that throng, who were amazed at the cardinal's politeness to that frail figure of a Flemish bailiff. End of chapter 3. Okay, so we just have a bunch of royal people coming out, and that's pretty much it. We have royal people coming out. The crowd is very excited and murmuring and unable to say or comprehend any of their titles, like me. And yeah. And we also get like a little inkling of elitism. And by little inkling, I mean not so subtle inkling of elitism, to be like, I have to make company with these beer drinkers. Ugh, disgusting. So we get the little upturned nose, and it is apparent. Apparent. And all of these little dribblings of contempt, I'm I am sure are just gonna get more and more blatant as we go along. So that's cool. Okay. We'll do just one more chapter. We'll do just one more chapter. Chapter 4. Master Jacques Campanule. While the pensioner of Ghent and his eminence were exchanging very low bows and a few words in voices still lower, a man of lofty stature, with a large face and broad shoulders, presented himself, in order to enter abreast with Guillaume Rime. One would have pronounced him a bulldog of the side of a fox. His felt doublet and leather jerkin made a spot on the velvet and silk which surrounded him. Presuming that he was some groom who had stolen in, the usher stopped him. "Hold, my friend, you cannot pass." The man in the leather jerkin shouldered him aside. "What does this knave want with me?" said he, in stentorian tones, which rendered the entire hall attentive to his strange colloquy. "Don't you see that I am one of them?" "Your name?" demanded the usher. "Jacques Coppenole." "Your titles?" "Hosier at the sign of the Three Little Chains of Ghent." The usher recoiled. One might bring one's self to announce aldermen and burgomasters, but a hosier was too much. The cardinal was on thorns. All the people were staring and listening. For 2 days his eminence had been exerting his utmost efforts to lick these Flemish bears into shape and to render them a little more presentable to the public, and this freak was startling. But Guillaume Rime, with his polished smile, approached the usher. "Announce Master Jacques Coppenole, clerk of the aldermen of the city of Ghent," he whispered very low. "Usher," interposed the cardinal aloud, "announce Master Jacques Coppenole, clerk of the aldermen of the illustrious city of Ghent." This was a mistake. Guillaume Rime alone might have conjured away the difficulty, but Coppenole had heard the cardinal. "No, cross of God!" he exclaimed in his voice of thunder. "Jacques Coppenole, Hosier. Do you hear, usher? Nothing more, nothing less. Cross of God, hosier. That's fine enough. Monsieur the Archduke has more than once sought his Gant in my house." And there's a note right after Gant, and it says, "Got the first idea of a thing." There we go. Laughter and applause burst forth. A jest is always understood in Paris, and consequently always applauded. Let us add that Coppenole was of the people, and that the auditors which surrounded him were also of the people. Thus the communication between him and them had been prompt, electric, and, so to speak, on a level. The haughty air of the Flemish hosier, by humiliating the courtiers, had touched in all these plebeian souls that latent sentiment of dignity still vague and indistinct in the 15th century. This hosier was an equal, who had just held his own before Monsieur the Cardinal, a very sweet reflection to poor fellows habituated to respect and obedience towards the underlings of the sergeants of the bailiff of Saint Genevieve, the cardinal's train-bearer. Cardinal proudly saluted his eminence, who returned the salute of the all-powerful bourgeois, feared by Louis XI. Then, while Guillaume Rime, a sage and malicious man as Philippe de Comines put in, watched them both with a smile of raillery and superiority, each sought his place, the cardinal quite abashed and troubled, Coppenol tranquil and haughty, and thinking, no doubt, that his title of hosier was as good as any other, after all, and that Marie of Burgundy, mother to that Marguerite whom Coppenol was today bestowing in marriage, would have been less afraid of the cardinal than of the hosier. For it is not a cardinal who would have stirred up a revolt among the men of Ghent against the favorites of the daughter of Charles the Bold. It is not a cardinal who could have fortified the populace with a word against her tears and prayers when the Maid of Flanders came to supplicate her people in their behalf, even at the very foot of the scaffold, while the hosier had only to raise his leather elbow in order to cause the fall your two heads, most illustrious seigneurs, Guy d'Imbercourt and Chancellor Guillaume Huguenet. Nevertheless, all was over for the poor cardinal, and he was obliged to quaff to the dregs the bitter cup of being in such bad company. The reader has, probably, not forgotten the impudent beggar who had been clinging fast to the fringes of the cardinal's gallery ever since the beginning of the prologue. The arrival of the illustrious guests had by no means caused him to relax his hold, and while the prelates and ambassadors were packing themselves into the stalls, like genuine Flemish herrings, he settled himself at his ease, and boldly crossed his legs on the architrave. The insolence of this proceeding was extraordinary, yet no one noticed it at first, the attention of all being directed elsewhere. He, on his side, perceived nothing that was going on in the hall. He wagged his head with the unconcern of a Neapolitan, repeating from time to time, amid the clamour, as from a mechanical habit, "Charity, please." And assuredly he was, out of all those present, the only one who had deigned to turn his head at the altercation between Coppenol and the usher. Now, chance ordained that the master hosier of Ghent, with whom the people were already in lively sympathy, and upon whom all eyes were riveted, should come and seat himself in the front row of the gallery directly above the mendicant, and people were not a little amazed to see the Flemish ambassador, on concluding his inspection of the knave thus placed between his eyes, bestow a friendly tap on that ragged shoulder. The beggar turned round. There was surprise, recognition, a lighting up of the two countenances, and so forth. Then, without paying the slightest heed in the world to the spectators, the hosier of the wretched being began to converse in a low tone, holding each other's hands in the meantime, while the rags of Clopen Trollefeu spread out upon the cloth of gold of the dais, produced the effect of a caterpillar on an orange. The novelty of this singular scene excited such a murmur of mirth and gaiety in the hall that the cardinal was not slow to perceive it. He half bent forward, and as from the point where he was placed he could catch only an imperfect view of Trollifoe's ignominious doublet. He was naturally imagined that the mendicant was asking alms, and, disguised with his audacity, he exclaimed, "Bailiff of the courts, toss me that knave into the river." "Cross of God, Monseigneur the Cardinal," said Coppenol, without quitting Clopin's hand. "He's a friend of mine." "Good, good!" shouted the populace. From that moment Master Coppenol enjoyed, in Paris as in Ghent, great favour with the people, for men of that sort do enjoy it, said Philippe de Comines, when they are thus disorderly. The cardinal bit his lips. He bent towards his neighbour, the Abbé of Saint Genevieve, and said to him in a low tone, "Fine ambassadors Monsieur the Archduke sends here, to announce to us Madame Marguerite." "Your Eminence," replied the Abbé, "wastes your politeness on these Flemish swine. Margaritas ante porcos, pearls before swine." "Say, rather," retorted the cardinal with a smile, "porcos ante margaritam, swine before the pearl." The whole little court in cassocks went into ecstasies over this play upon words. The cardinal felt a little relieved. He was quits with Coppenol. He also had his jest applauded. Now, will those of our readers who possess the power of generalizing an image or an idea, as the expression runs in the style of today, permit us to ask them if they have formed a very clear conception of the spectacle presented at this moment, upon which we have arrested our attention, by the vast parallelogram of the grand hall of the palace. In the middle of the hall, backed against the western wall, a large and magnificent gallery draped with cloth of gold, into which enter in procession, through a small arched door, grave personages, announced successively by the shrill voice of an usher. On the front benches were already a number of venerable figures, muffled in ermine, velvet, and scarlet. Around the dais, which remains silent and dignified, below, opposite, everywhere, a great crowd and a great murmur. Thousands of glances directed by the people on each face upon the dais, 1,000 whispers over each name. Certainly the spectacle is curious, and well deserves the attention of the spectators. But yonder, quite at the end, what is that sort of trestle work with 4 motley puppets upon it, and more below? Who is that man beside the trestle, with a black doublet and a pale face? Alas, my dear reader, it is Pierre Gringoire and his prologue. We have all forgotten him completely. This is precisely what he feared. From the moment of the cardinal's entrance, Gringoire had never ceased to tremble for the safety of his prologue. At first he had enjoined the actors, who had stopped in suspense, to continue, and to raise their voices. Then, perceiving that no one was listening, he had stopped them, and during the entire quarter of an hour of that the interruption lasted, he had not ceased to stamp, to flounce about, to appeal to Gisquette, and to urge his neighbors to the continuance of the prologue, all in vain. No one quitted the cardinal, the embassy, and the gallery, sole centre of this vast circle of visual rays. We must also believe, and we say it with regret, that the prologue had begun slightly to weary the audience at a moment when his eminence had arrived, and created a diversion in so terrible a fashion. After all, on the gallery as well as on the marble table, the spectacle was the same. The conflict of labor and clergy, of nobility and merchandise. And many people preferred to see them alive, breathing, moving, elbowing each other in flesh and blood in this Flemish embassy and this episcopal court, under the cardinal's robe, under Coppenol's jerkin, then painted, decked out, talking in verse and, so to speak, stuffed beneath the yellow amid white tunics in which Gringoire had so ridiculously clothed them. Nevertheless, when our poet beheld quiet re-established to some extent, he devised a stratagem which might have redeemed all. Monsieur, he said, turning towards one of his neighbors, a fine, big man with a patient face, suppose we begin again? What? Said his neighbor. Hey, the mystery, said Gringoire. As you like, returned his neighbor. This semi-approbation sufficed for Gringoire, and, conducting his own affairs, he began to shout, confounding himself with the crowd as much as possible. Begin the mystery again. Begin again. The devil, said Johann de Molendino. What are they jabbering down yonder at the end of the hall? For Gringoire was making noise enough for four. Say, comrades, isn't that mystery finished? They want to begin it all over again. That's not fair. No, no, shouted all the scholars. Down with the mystery, down with it. But Gringoire had multiplied himself, and only shouted the more vigorously, Begin again! Begin again! These clamours attracted the attention of the cardinal. Monsieur Bailiff of the courts, said he to a tall black man, placed a few paces behind him, are those knaves in a holy water vessel, that they make such a hellish noise? The bailiff of the courts was a sort of amphibious magistrate, a sort of bat of the judicial order, related to both the rat and the bird, the judge and the soldier. He approached his eminence, and not without a good deal of fear of the latter's displeasure, he awkwardly explained to him the seeming disrespect of the audience, that noonday had arrived before his eminence, and that the comedians had been forced to begin without waiting for his eminence. The cardinal burst into a laugh. Oh, my faith, the rector of the university ought to have done the same. What say you, Master Guillaume Rime? Monseigneur, replied Guillaume Rime, let us be content with having escaped half of the comedy. There is at least that much gained. Can these rascals continue their farce? Asked the bailiff. Continue, said the cardinal. It's all the same to me. I'll read my breviary in the meantime. The bailiff advanced to the edge of the estrade and cried, after having invoked silence by a wave of his hand, Bourgeois, rustics, and citizens, in order to satisfy those who wish the play to begin again and those who wish it to end, his eminence order that it be continued. Both parties were forced to resign themselves, but the public and the author long cherished a grudge against the cardinal. So the personages on the stage took up their parts, and Gringoire hoped that the rest of his work, at least, would be listened to. This hope was speedily dispelled like his other illusions. Silence had indeed been restored in the audience after a fashion, but Gringoire had not observed that at the moment when the cardinal gave the order to continue, the gallery was far from full, and that after the Flemish envoys there had arrived new personages forming part of the cortege, whose names and ranks, shouted at the midst of his dialogue by the intermittent cry of the usher, produced considerable ravages in it. Let the reader imagine the effect in the midst of a theatrical piece, of the yelping of an usher, flinging in between two rhymes, and often in the middle of a line, parentheses like the following: Master Jacques Carmolu, procurator of the king of the ecclesiastical courts. Jehan de Harlay, equerry guardian of the office of chevalier of the night watch of the city of Paris. Messire Galliot of Geniorac, chevalier Seigneur de Broussac, master of the king's artillery. Master Reguiar, surveyor of the woods and forests of the king our sovereign, in the land of France, Champagne, and Brie. Monsieur Louis de Gravy, chevalier, consular, and chamberlain of the king, Admiral of France, keeper of the forest of Vincennes, Master Denis Le Mercier, guardian of the House of the Blind at Paris, etc., etc., etc. This was becoming unbearable. This strange accompaniment, which rendered it difficult to follow the piece, made Gringoire all the more indignant because he could not conceal from himself the fact that the interest was continually increasing, and that all his work required was a chance of being heard. It was, in fact, difficult to imagine a more ingenious and more dramatic composition. The four personages of the prologue were bewailing themselves in their mortal embarrassment when Venus, in person, presented herself to them, clad in a fine robe, bearing the heraldic device of the ship of the city of Paris. She had come herself to claim the dolphin promised to the most beautiful. Jupiter, whose thunder could be heard rumbling in the dressing room, supported her claim, and Venus was on the point of carrying it off, that is to say, without allegory, of marrying Monsieur the Dauphin, when a young child clad in white damask and holding in her hand a daisy, a transparent personification of Mademoiselle Marguerite of Flanders, came to contest it with the Venus. Theatrical effect and change. After a dispute, Venus, Marguerite, and the assistants agreed to submit to the good judgment of Time, Holy Virgin. There was another good part, that the king of Mesopotamia, but through so many interruptions, it was difficult to make out what end he served. All these persons had ascended by the ladder to the stage. But all was over. None of these beauties had been felt or understood. On the entrance of the cardinal, one would have said that an invisible magic thread had suddenly drawn all glances from the marble table to the gallery, from the southern to the western extremity of the hall. Nothing could disenchant the audience. All eyes remained fixed there, and the newcomers and their accursed names and their faces and their costumes afforded a continual diversion. This was very distressing, with the exception of Gisquette and Leonard, who turned round from time to time when Gringoire plucked them by the sleeve, with the exception of the big, patient neighbor. No one listened. No one looked at the poor, deserted morality full face. Gringoire saw only profiles. With what bitterness did he behold his whole erection of glory and of poetry crumble away bit by bit. And to think that these people had been upon the point of instituting a revolt against the bailiff through impatience to hear his work. Now that they had it, they did not care for it. This same representation which had been begun amid so unanimous an acclamation, eternal flood and ebb of popular favor, to think that they had been on the point of hanging the bailiff's sergeant. What would he not have given to be still at that hour of honey? But the usher's brutal monologue came to an end. Everyone had arrived, and Gringoire breathed freely once more. The actors continued bravely, but Master Coppenol, the hosier, must needs rise of a sudden, and Gringoire was forced to listen to him deliver, amid universal attention, the following abominable harangue. Messrs. and bourgeois, and esquires of Paris, I don't know, cross by God, what we are doing here. I certainly do see yonder in the corner on that stage some people who appear to be fighting. I don't know whether that is what you call a mystery, but it is not amusing. They quarrel with their tongues and nothing more. I have been waiting for the first blow this quarter of an hour. Nothing comes. They are cowards who only scratch each other with insults. You ought to send for the fighters of London or Rotterdam, and I can tell you, you would have had blows of the fist that could be heard in the place. But these men excite our pity. They ought at least to give some Moorish dance or some other mummer. That is not what was told me. I was promised a feast of fools with the election of a pope. We have our Pope of Fools at Ghent also. We're not behindhand in that, cross of God. But this is the way we manage it. We collect a crowd like this one here. Then each person in turn passes his head through a hole and makes a grimace at the rest. Time one who makes the ugliest is elected Pope by general acclamation. That's the way it is. It is very diverting. Would you like to make your Pope after the fashion of my country? At all events, it will be less wearisome than to listen to chatterers. If they wish to come and make their grimaces through the hole, they can join the game. What say you, messieurs les bourgeois? You have here enough grotesque specimens of both sexes to allow of laughing in Flemish fashion, and there are enough of us ugly incontinents to hope for a fine grinning match. Gringoire would have liked to retort. Stupefaction, rage, indignation deprived him of words. Moreover, the suggestion of the popular Hoosier was deceived with such enthusiasm by these bourgeois who were flattered at being called squires, that all resistance was useless. There was nothing to be done but to allow one's self to drift with the torrent. Gringoire hid his face between his two hands, not being so fortunate as to have a mantle with which to veil his head, like Agamemnon of Timantis. End of chapter 4. Okay, so moving right along. More people are coming in. And while all of this is happening and the whole crowd is looking at all of these fancy people from all around come in and just like murmur their excitement, the mystery is being ignored, and Gringoire is upset by this. But before we get to that, Copinol, our good friend, recognizes the knave, the beggar, and brings him over. They're having a little chat, and the cardinal is like, or somebody, I don't remember who it was, it might not have been the cardinal, was like, throw him into the river, like just get rid of him. And Copinol speaks up and he's like, he's my friend, don't do that, I know him, he's good people. And so they are like, all right, fine, he can stay. And so that's a fun little insight into who this person is. And also, he is, like, not like high society, like the others of the court that are there, but also not like low society. But to the high society, they're like, oh my God, do we really have to introduce him? Embarrassing. But they do introduce him. And so all of that is happening. And at the same time, Gringoire is trying so hard to bring back the attention of the crowd to the play because it is his masterpiece. It is his masterpiece. And nobody's paying attention. And he like taps his neighbor. He's like, please, please, like watch my thing. And he's making so much noise now and just causing such a ruckus that the cardinal notices and is like, what is going on? Like, what is happening? And the bailiff explains, and the cardinal is like, oh, okay, all right, well, just like let them continue. They can't start over, but let them continue with the rest of the mystery. That's fine. And so it has been deemed that it is okay. So Gringoire is like, oh, good, okay, let's go. He's a little sad that they don't get to restart so people can see the whole thing, but he is also glad that like people are now paying attention. So the whole audience just like turns back to looking at the mystery. And as this is going, they are still getting interrupted by more people entering and being announced. And so people are still like turning their heads, and nobody is paying attention to this mystery. And Gringoire is just seeing like the side of people's faces instead of people like actually paying attention. And so this is like a battle that he's sort of going through. And while all of this has happened, Copinol is like, what's going on over there? Like, this is supposed to be like a mystery, and this is not that. Like, there There's no fighting. What, are they just gonna talk? What, are they just throwing insults at people? This is not good. I came here for a feast of fools. And in in my in my country, in my area, this is how we do it. There's enough ugly people here to have the feast of fools and to laugh at them. Let's say we do that. Cool. And that's where we ended with that chapter. And that's going to be where we end tonight. But Victor Hugo's writing is so good. I am enjoying it so far. I really like the commentary that Hugo is doing here, and like he did in I mean, this one came out first, but like he did in The Man Who Laughs, like having all of the nobility and like poking fun at their titles and their, of this land and like the things that they own and things like that, like going above and beyond, over the top, is very much present and is great. And just we are getting the little seedlings of what is to come. And I'm excited. I'm excited to see where we go with this. And Hugo's writing is it's just so good. He's a master of his craft. Thank you all for being here. As always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate you. And I 1000% appreciate your support. If I don't see you next time, I hope to see you very soon. Goodbye.